Hello, I'm Jan Wasitsky, and I'm here today with Professor Weston Bate, OAM. Professor Weston Bate is a social historian, and amongst his many books, there's two in particular we're going to talk about today in relation to the Victorian gold rushes. First of all, Lucky City, which is the history of the first generation of people who made Ballarat, and published in 1988, the Victorian gold rushes. Weston Bate received his OAM for services to history and heritage, but he began his working career after World War II as a primary school teacher. Later, in 1965, he became the head of Australian history at Melbourne University, following in that role from Manning Clark and Geoffrey Searle. Today, he's retired, but here, at the ripe old age of 88, he's still going strong. And Weston Bate, thank you for having us in your home here in Brighton in Victoria.
It's my pleasure, Jan.
We're going to talk about the gold rush and, in particular, the monster meeting. And can we begin with, I'll put it to you that the gold rush of 1850 in Victoria, to most Australian people, is a little understood event. It's an event the story hasn't been widely comprehended by the general Australian population. Just briefly, before we get into it proper, why is it that it's important for us to understand what happened in Victoria in the 1850s?
Well, I think we had one of the world's great social revolutions. Not a revolution in a sense, but an evolution out of moves that have been going on in Britain for centuries. But there was the opportunity here, through the energy that people were given by gold, that democratic mineral, as I like to call it, or they became radical capitalists. They had money that had never been possessed by people of their class before. And yet their setting was a sense of the proper relationship between those who knew and had governed in the feudal system and beyond, and those who obeyed orders and were part of the, what we call economic fodder, I suppose, of the society, who did all the work.
Okay, you've mentioned three big ideas in there. One about the situation in Europe and the ideas that were around. Two, the idea of gold as a democratic mineral. And the third one, radical capitalism. Can we just go back and briefly, what were these ideas that were about coming from Europe at the time?
Well, Europe had had its 1848 revolutions in which there had been an attempt to get, as we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment, popular government. And the forces that held sway, the conservative elements, managed to hold back that avalanche, as the British had held back the Chartist movement, which was trying to reform Parliament. And I think what was going on here was that people were sensing that they had an opportunity that would make them, as Ballarat people later called themselves, the best of Britons. They weren't ashamed in any sense of having taken away those old ideas about class and running with their own perceptions of how people ought to behave together. And I think what you see most in the Victorian scene is a new democracy. It's not just a political democracy, although that was leading the world, but it's a social democracy.
And what does that mean?
It means that people were asserting that anybody's value was the same as another's, that everyone was equal. And it had been said in the French Revolution, equality, fraternity, and all that sort of thing. But it had never before been given the force that it was here, and that's because of that democratic mineral. And what astonishes people is to understand that capital and labour, as in the 8 Hours Day, the Melbourne stonemasons joined together to achieve a benchmark of the way people ought to be allowed decent lives. 8 hours labour, 8 hours rest, 8 hours recreation. And the Victorian coming together of capital and labour, and it happened first in the deep sinkings at Ballarat. It had to. The storekeepers had to support the parties of miners who had perilous tasks to undergo. And that marriage of capital and labour gave us Victoria, little L liberalism, which the Victorians took into the Commonwealth, and which has been, in a way, the ongoing power of Victoria's place in the ideas in the Commonwealth.
Little L liberalism came from Victoria, came from the gold rushes.
Absolutely.
And in this sense, little L liberalism meaning every person, a fair go.
And people with the means giving to those who didn't. In other words, Alfred Deakin and the first old age pensions, the first ideas about really what was to be the 20th century's great gift to mankind, the welfare state, which the Americans don't seem to understand.
Yes, it's very interesting to watch them objecting to a good health system for everybody. It's nonplussing to us, isn't it? Well,
big ideas were running, Jan. Big ideas were running in Victoria.
Yesterday, yesterday after talking to David Bernier, Davide, who's on the other end of the camera here, said, "It seems like in digging the gold out of the earth, they dug democracy out of the government."
I love it. Yeah. I like to say they were digging capital and nobody could get between them and that capital, because gold, of course, was currency. It lubricated the world's economy. And if you had it, you had cash. That's the beauty of it.
Without a middleman.
Yeah. Do away with the middleman. Do away with borrowing. Ballarat didn't have to borrow because it dug its capital. It had very little outside injection of capital. Bendigo, although lost the great surface that it had had, and it was a break before the courts came in, and they didn't have the capital to investigate that court, so they had to borrow from outside. Whereas Ballarat, those deep holes that they'd sunk in the Ballarat Basin, they continued on under the basalt plateau of Ballarat, searching. And it's the continuum that's very important about Ballarat's story. And
let's come back to Ballarat. Can we talk about Victoria before the gold rush? Victoria becomes a colony in its own right on July the 1st, 1851. La Trobe becomes the governor, lieutenant governor of Victoria, of the colony of Victoria, and very soon there's a legislative council instituted. What's the political system? What's the relationship between the legislative council and Governor La Trobe, and who has the power over what?
Well, he relies on them to give him the laws that he can use to institute his policies. So he really is hamstrung by them in the amount that he can do. On the other hand, the executive has much more power than it does in our present system. And the point about Victoria is that it had had a great pastoral rush before the gold rush.
Yes.
And that was well established. So Victoria is a capitalist free enterprise colony with the best sheep country that had yet been explored. And those pastoralists were people of importance, and they were hoping to become a sort of landed aristocracy, not quite in that full sense, but gentry, important people at the peak of society. And they're the people mainly, apart from some merchants, who are on the Legislative Council. And they were, in a sense, not controlling La Trobe, but limiting his possibilities.
So the squatters who were well represented in the Victorian Legislative Council, being out in the country, those that were in the gold country, surely they would have known of the gold on their property before the gold rush.
There were rumours that gold had been sighted, but the pastoralists didn't want to be disturbed by people chasing after gold.
There's a woman up at Castlemaine, Eliza Tree, who has put forward the idea that it was the sheep's cloven hoofs and the other horses that started unearthing the gold, because the Jara people had ignored it for centuries. Do you think there might be anything in that theory?
Well, I respect Eliza's view, and it's possible. It's good fun to think about why it hadn't been important before, and suddenly we get this huge burst of chasing gold.
Yes, because Major Mitchell passed through there in 1836, and so it took another 15 years before the gold rush happened.
Yeah, and he would have had an eye to what the country held.
So anyway, back in Melbourne, we've got the Legislative Council and La Trobe, the governor. Do you have an idea of La Trobe's character? What sort of man was he in relation to the actions he's going to take, such as the gold licence?
Yeah, humane, scholarly, aware of what people were thinking, but perhaps too gentle to take it all into his own hands and deal with something that was unprecedented. I don't know enough about La Trobe to make a full judgment, but it seems that he didn't fully understand that ordinary people would be so effective in chasing this mineral. And he felt very strongly, coming from a gentry background, that it was senseless to disturb the order of society. You're risking what you really believe in. And he was most concerned that if people chased gold, they'd leave their ordinary occupations, and that the pastoralists would lose the labour that would shear the sheep and look after them, that staple of the colony, which, on which it had been founded. So we get this break or conflict between the two foundations of Victoria, the pastoral and the gold. And La Trobe is on the side of not just the pastoralists, but of trying to keep the civilised society holding together, so that he doesn't want everything running amok. And that's what seemed was going to happen.
And when you're talking about La Trobe's view of what a civilised society is, in his dispatches to Earl Grey in London, he calls the ordinary people the lower classes and the indigenous, and words such as this, which is terms no Governor-General would dare use today. But to him, he wouldn't have even noticed he was using them?
No, of course not. And people would all understand that that was the way society worked.
So he's the governor of a brand new colony. There's a gold rush in New South Wales. To prevent an exodus of Victorians to New South Wales, he follows New South Wales and offers a reward for gold. But then when gold is found, and contrary to his wishes for his version of the stable society, the gold rush starts. So then he follows New South Wales again, and he imposes a gold licence, 30 shillings a month to go and dig for gold, payable before you started working. Is keeping everybody in society in their allotted place his only reason for the gold licence?
I think initially, yes, but it soon becomes imperative for his finances.
When the gold rush begins, from my reading of it, it feels like Latrobe is suddenly faced as the governor with an existential crisis in his colony, and this must have been very, very threatening.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to feel for him. I mean, he was a man who had given Victoria such a sense of possibility, and Melbourne, you know, the idea of its parks and so on, although Hoddle had generated some of that, Latrobe was ferocious about making sure land was set aside for proper parks.
Yes, so we wouldn't want to judge him solely on actions like instituting a gold licence and solely on giving police half of the fines they've got. He had other erudite and sophisticated agendas.
Yes. But a far-sighted and perhaps a man more experienced with conflict might have seen that he had to face that Legislative Council and make sure that the gold licence was replaced with a duty on gold, an export duty.
And that's something I've never been able to come to an understanding of, reading, say, the Argus from the time. Why couldn't he go for the solution of putting a royalty? What was stopping him?
Oh, I think it was partly the merchant's concern, and he might have shared that there could be a lot of smuggling of gold, getting away from the duty.
Yep.
But also there was a sense that that many of the councillors thought that it was a bad policy, and that really the taxing was force onto the diggers to keep them in order. And, you know, this sort of sense of we're really going to push it at you infuriated the diggers, and the idea of paying 30 shillings was a huge amount in those days. I mean, it'd be £500 now, probably, something like that, $500, just to start digging. And there was, you know, a really strong protest at Buninyong, then at Ballarat. But it's when they say we'll double the licence before Christmas in 1851, partly it would seem to ensure that people didn't leave their ordinary occupations, but also because of the revenue. As soon as that was known early in December, everybody was up in arms because they were all, you know, leaving places like Brighton, I wrote my first book about. It was denuded.
And there was 2 policemen left in Melbourne, I've read.
Yeah, off they went. So it's something that should have given the government pause. And Latrobe writes in his dispatches, you know, everybody's going. There's hardly anybody left. Should have understood that this isn't something that's just, you know, a few thugs running around trying to get money.
But he seems, from reading the laws, to be so disorganised or so So he seems, you might disagree and tell me more, to be a ditherer, because it takes him, first of all, he appoints the head land commissioner as the gold commissioner, and it takes him about another 6 weeks to appoint gold commissioners, which is again converted land commissioners.
Yeah.
Why is all of this taking so long? I'm thinking, is he paralysed, or is he hamstrung by the Legislative Council?
I don't know. I'll be honest with you, I haven't really looked at that in any depth. But it's such a terrible system that's set up. And of course, if he's dithering, if he's worried, if he doesn't know what's the right way to go, to set up something that looks strong. But he hasn't got the kind of people. He's got very few people he can appoint as Crown Lands Commissioners for the goldfields who can really do the job. And some of them, just aggravated the population.
Yes.
And they set them apart in these government camps, which, seem to be, as William Howard said, they were like an aristocracy riding across the goldfields in their green uniforms and gold lace. But they were doing very well in the camps.
If you came around the hill, say to the gold rush at Mount Alexander on Forest Creek, they estimate that in early December there's 20,000, maybe 25,000 people there. What scene would greet you? What would it look like? What would it sound like?
Well, they were using the Californian cradles, and all I know about the sound is that somebody approaching Ballarat a month or two earlier said that the sound of the cradles was like distant thunder, and the activity would be immense, and they're digging in their holes and then going to the creek to wash, and the water becomes very significant to them.
So a Californian cradle is...
You rock it like a baby.
And
actually
inside...
a hand from side to side.
Mm-hmm. And inside the cradle?
The gravels and the clays are separated in the system, and the gold is held.
And so the rocks with the water back and forwards.
Yeah, it's
sounds like
mixing
thunder.
Yeah.
As you approach.
Yeah. Tremendous activity. 20 or 30, 25,000 people. And, not all of them digging, not all of them washing at the same time or anything, but a hell of a lot of noise going on. And, there's shouts to each other and all that sort of thing. And then, of course, at night when they let off their pistols, because they were very concerned that they weren't going to have sodden charges in their pistols so that they could fire if they were going to be held up by anybody. Quite a lot of tension in that way.
So how many of the diggers would have had a firearm?
I think quite a high proportion. By the accounts, that it was traditional for them to have.
Traditional for the diggers or for every person?
Well, not for every
man?
person, no, for them to get firearms. I don't know that anybody has studied what proportion had them. But they do talk about them, letting off their revolvers before nightfall.
You're saying it's to keep the powder
Yeah, keep the charge.
Keep the charge.
From being sodden.
It was also suggested that it might be to warn anybody else. We've got a pistol, don't try and steal our gold.
Yeah, maybe.
What a scene though. Night time.
Yeah.
Getting dark.
All the
campfires.
fires. Yeah. Oh.
But people firing pistols.
Yeah. But this is what happens, isn't it, in the Middle East, where they fire off at the end of the day, or with jubilation if they've won something. Up they go.
Yes, I've often wondered where the bullets
Where the
come
bullets
down.
land, yeah. But it's a lightly forested area, and there are all the trees and the campfires and the spread of people and the holes. It's a great scene of human activity.
And the mix of people there, what sorts of mainly men? I know there was some women, but mainly men.
Very
they
few
were.
women. And by Mount Alexander time, quite a few from South Australia, Tasmania, New South Wales, and fear that numbers of them were ex-convicts who weren't to be trusted. But it's a pretty silly idea, isn't it, that mostly the ex-convicts were well behaved, because most of them had been in precarious situations in Britain. They'd stolen something small, but put them into this situation, they don't need to steal anything.
No, they've got a chance of actually putting their life on an even keel.
Yeah.
Maybe for the first time.
Yeah. So they're really smeared, I think, in the public imagination, and in the official imagination, certainly.
Yes, there's particular fear of convicts from Van Diemen's Land coming over.
Yeah, bad people.
Were middle classes there digging?
Absolutely. Everybody, even clergymen.
So it was from across society, the people on the Goldfields.
That's why Melbourne was denuded of people. And Latrobe says, of course, that the shopkeepers and the employers went because they didn't have anybody to work for them. So they had to go too.
And their customers had all deserted
they've
town.
all gone.
Right, okay. So 25,000 people on Mount Alexander, the really big rush.
It's quite a proportion of Victoria's population, which was getting into the 90,000 total population. Probably about, of those, not many more than 40 to 50,000 men. So 20 to 25,000 is a big proportion.
So maybe approaching 50% of the male population.
At least, yeah.
Gee, that's astonishing when you think of it in those terms. So the institution of the gold licence for 30 shillings a month to keep people in their allotted place did not work.
No, hopeless.
And Latrobe's next move, which was to double it, which he did on December the 1st, 1851.
Well, he didn't. He was proposing to.
He was going to bring that in on on January the 1st?
Yeah.
So when he issues a proclamation, that is not law, that is a proposal as such?
It wasn't proclaimed. It was understood that that was going to happen.
So he did write to Earl Grey on the 3rd of December, proposing it to Earl Grey, which in a sense seems slightly ridiculous because he hasn't got email.
An answer.
And the thing is dated, it's stamped that it landed in London on April the 6th and then printed for Parliament in June. So he, on the timescale of things back then, he had no hope of actually getting ratification at all.
No, he's on his own.
You're the first person that's commented that it was only a proposal rather than an actual law. So that's very interesting. What is then a proclamation?
Well, a proclamation is a published document which says that this is what the government is going to do, and it sets down the date when that proclamation comes into effect. Now, I stand to be corrected. He may have prepared that. But as far as I know, and Geoffrey Searle, certainly in his golden age, says that it was understood that he was going to raise the licence fee. So he'd probably put it to the council. The council may have agreed, but no action had been taken at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody knows and they start protesting about it.
Yes. Given what you said before, that at this point of time, it moves from being just, the licence moves from being just a method of keeping people in their place in society to also revenue raising, because clearly it's failed. But from his political point of view, were there other alternatives at that point of time to doubling the fee?
Well, just the duty on gold.
Which he didn't. I think in his letters to Earl Grey, he's saying that the Legislative Council won't agree to that.
Yeah.
So as a result of the news that the licence is to be doubled to £3 a month, keeping in mind that Barker, the squatter, upon whose run this gold rush has happened, he's paying the government £10 a year for 30,000 acres.
Yeah. Well, that's the extraordinary anomaly.
So how did the diggers react?
Well, in fury, and they form an association and they have meetings and they decide that they won't pay that licence. And, the monster meeting really is the culmination of all sorts of people's protesting. And governments come to think that these protests were engineered by agitators like John Harrison, the former squatter, the former sea captain, who was a marvellous demagogue, who got them in.
Yes.
And along with Dr. Webb Richmond, he formed the association that was going to defend the diggers' rights. And you can see that monster meeting dwelling upon all the things that have been circulating among them about the injustice of this tax. And I guess many of them were thinking of the Americans and their antipathy to the tax that George III was imposing. And you get a common sense of this is a new country, we want to build a new and fair society, and we're not going to be beaten over the head by the old world and its sense of what ought to be done.
Yes, I've got here in front of me a transcript of what the Argus reported was said at the monster meeting, and there is a real mix of things said from the podium, which was a dray.
Yeah.
And excuse me. Can I mention a few of them? Because they called it, and it was Potts, the first speaker.
Yeah.
He called it an illegal taxation. He's the only one I've ever heard read said it was illegal.
Yeah, nonsense. It was quite legal.
Right. He said His Excellency has no power to tax us. So he's trying this on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It seems like neither are they advocating physical force at this point of time.
No.
It's Potts who also continues, it is useless to talk of physical force. Moral force is what is required.
Yeah.
Potts also goes on, as do a couple of others, or at least Harrison in the meeting, when he said, it was such a taxation that lost Great Britain America.
Yeah.
I hope, brother diggers, as a Briton, such unjust taxation will not be the cause of separating these splendid colonies from the mother country. How serious do you think
Oh,
he is?
Harrison was a very strong Republican. Oh, he's mighty serious.
That's Potts there. Harrison
Oh,
did,
that was Potts.
Harrison
sorry.
did say it in another way later.
Yeah, no.
So we don't know about Potts, but Harrison himself would have been pushing for that.
Oh, sure. Would have been saying that we'd be better off without the interference from over there.
So is he a Republican?
Harrison was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Potts here, he continues, he acknowledges that there were few, he said, who would advocate separation. But he continues that there are also few who do not love the country of their adoption, few who do not feel themselves free, and none I trust who would be slaves.
Yeah. Well, that lies behind what I was saying earlier about the power and the energy that was given to them by the democratic mineral, that those ideas are in their heads and they're now going to be given the strength to do it.
And this has been given to them by the democratic mineral,
God.
an independent income.
Yeah. Mind you, not everybody made a great deal out of that rush, but what happened was that the total capital of it was sustaining this broad new wave of democratic society.
Potts also says that this is the first chance the labouring classes have had to do good and not let them not abuse it.
Yeah, this is good stuff.
These people are talking about a huge change in the world, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, that's what I say. It's a social revolution.
When before this you couldn't necessarily dream
Think of yourself in that way.
And you couldn't think of moving out of the allotted spot and maybe the drudgery.
Dependence. This offers independence. And, it's a great human goal, as we know to this day.
There's others who speak also about they're not advocates for forcible resistance, which we'll get to it later is not the way it was 3 years later at Eureka. They do say they are willing to defend themselves if they have to.
Which is exactly what happened at Eureka.
Harrison, he seems to make claims that might be a bit outlandish as well. He says there's now a surplus of £13,000 which has been screwed out of the sinews of the gold diggers. If nobody was paying the tax, how were they? They were avoiding the tax.
Yeah.
But he said that they will publish to the world by every means in our power our determination not to pay the tax. This is a strength that these people have never had en masse before.
No. It's exactly what was taken up 2 years later at Bendigo, the Red Ribbon Movement, the determination not to pay the unjust tax.
Yes. Here's what Harrison said regarding America. He considered the tax unconstitutional, which is, again, probably trying it on. He said it was a similar tax that lost Charles I his head. It was unjust taxation that caused the United States to throw off the burden, and unless the government learns a little wisdom, an additional tax might lead to the same result here. How many of the diggers would have been in that camp?
Oh,
do you think?
I think probably a great majority.
Even though they were proud Britons?
Yeah, but proud Britons would realise that mistakes were made which cost Britain America. I think you don't say my country was always right. You can be proud of Britain but realise that it was stupid to lose the American colonies in the way they did. And certainly to feel that there's a danger here, that Britons are being treated in a way that they never should have been. So that they're using America to say we're Britons as the Americans were, but we're not going to be treated like this.
It's Harrison who continues, "Let us, my friends, unite as one people," great cheering, "without respect to creed or country, and victory will crown our efforts." David Bonnier, whom you know, has a sense that it was at the monster meeting that the diggers became the diggers. Do you have a
Well, they hadn't had a
comment
chance
on that?
before. I would agree that there was no previous protest that had that unanimity, hadn't needed to. This is a threat to everybody in a way that it hadn't been before, because previously those who were doing well weren't worried by the licence. Here, everybody's being threatened by the doubling.
Yes. So there's a sense of identity coming in here.
Yeah. And it's experience. They've now had experience and they know what it's like. And they're transmitting that experience to those who are just coming for the first time. So you're getting induction into the story. And that's why so many who had been to the goldfields understood after Eureka, as Melbourne residents, that the whole system had been corrupt and quite wrong. And it was Melbourne really that did made the final blow to Hotham's reputation, because the popular meeting there just said, no way, we're not going to support the governor.
Which is in a couple of years' time. 15,000 people turned up at the monster meeting, possibly the largest gathering of human beings on this continent to date. To that point of time.
To that time.
To that point of time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that lovely statement of solidarity. We're in this together. We are the people.
Yes. Well, they're calling themselves citizens.
Yeah, yep.
They're not regarding themselves as subjects.
Yeah, and also I think we have to be careful with the term diggers, because, they weren't all digging. Many were carting, many were setting up stores, and I always put a quotation mark around diggers, because it's the population of the goldfields, particularly when you get to Ballarat later. So many of them are in their ordinary jobs.
Yes, supplying the diggers.
And yeah.
The other interesting thing that's said at the actual monster meeting by I think it's Webb Richmond. Which is, if I can just check, yes, this other interesting thing by Webb Richmond, who towards the end of the meeting is reported as saying, there are few people who properly understand what a government is or what it ought to be. It should be the chosen servants of a free people. Now, we assume that today.
Yeah.
That's unthinkable that you wouldn't be thinking that.
Yeah, but that's when you start to get the sense that we need a political answer to this whole question. And that becomes clearer and clearer as you go through to Eureka.
But as a result of the monster meeting and a meeting that took place a week before where a mere 4,000 turned up, the diggers learn 3 or 4 days later that the trade's backed off. He's not going to double the licence. But simultaneously, he institutes police on half of the fines they can collect and paid informers.
Yeah.
Which is bringing in the real trouble. Why is he making what we now in hindsight regard as dramatic political mistakes?
Well, he can't get police. He's driven to desperation.
So this is perks for police to get them into the job?
Yeah.
And that's all
Hold
it
them
is?
there. Keep them there. I mean, these people at Forest Creek are making more than ever was possible for them to make in their lives before. And to expect other people to take jobs that are hardly paid more than a pittance in the police is hopeless. And that's why Latrobe sort of, I think stupidly, but he doesn't have the funds himself to pay them at the rates. It's what the present mining boom is doing to labour, to raise the price of labour, so that the diggers were raising the price of labour in the sense of they're making much more than wages. And Latrobe somehow or other has to find police to keep them in order. Why he wanted police? I mean, the big step would have been to organise a proper democratic running of the goldfields. But that was out of sight at the time. Not in anybody's mind.
What would that have looked like if it was possible?
Well, it would have looked a bit like California, but not the same.
Which is?
I mean, they had a sort of goldfield running itself, but the tendency was for the vigilante types to take control. So you got lynchings and nastiness. But there were signs on the Victorian goldfields that people could have run it themselves. And they did for a time at Ballarat before the authorities arrived. They apportioned claims and they looked after things. But how exactly you might have done that at the end of 1851 would pose huge problems for any thinker about how to deal with this situation. So I think Latrobe's to be excused for giving police that stimulus, but it's going to cost the whole system dearly at Ballarat in 1854.
And before we get to Ballarat in 1854, there's the Red Ribbon agitation in Bendigo in 1853.
Yeah. When the goldfield, the surface was petering out, people were saying, look, the licence is too heavy for us to keep going. And they refused to pay. And as a sign that they weren't going to pay, they put red ribbons in their coats. And Latrobe gave in. And he made the decision, again a vital one, to allow them to take out licences at any time for 3, 6 or 12 months. And most of them took out 3-month licences. And the problem for Hotham later was that he had to institute twice weekly hunts for unlicensed diggers because licences could be due any day, whereas before that had been the first of the month. And you knew perfectly well anybody after the first of the month could be, if they didn't have a licence, you got them. Whereas later you had to inspect everybody all the time to see whether they had a licence or not.
So by instituting
something much more liberal, he's created what proved to be, in those Ballarat deep sinkings, a tremendous burden on authority.
with a bureaucratic nightmare.
Yeah.
At Bendigo in 1853, with the Red Ribbon agitation, they, as a group, formed an association, and they got a petition up, and they took the petition to other goldfields. I've seen a replica of it. It's about 15 metres long and about a metre wide, signed by 25,000 people. And at the head of the petition is their demands. They want a reduction of the licence fee. They want an end to the police brutality, who are chaining people to trees or chaining them to a horse and making them walk around all day on the back of a horse. And here I'd like to introduce this idea of democracy coming out of this.
Yeah.
It's the first account I've read on this petition of the diggers saying, we want a vote.
Yeah, exactly. It's there.
And even if back at the monster meeting at Castlemaine, Forest Creek, if anybody was thinking about a vote, they weren't saying it as yet publicly on the podium.
No.
And with the meeting, the big meeting at Bendigo in August 1853, unlike the monster meeting, we've now got people from all around the world here.
Yeah.
The monster meeting was still the locals,
Just
South
Britons.
Australia, New South Wales, Melbourne,
Yeah.
those who could get there. But we've got all of the nationalities here now. We've got Hungarians and Poles and Germans marching behind their banners.
People out of the 1848 revolutions.
Yes. And the meeting took place on View Street, roundabout where the Bendigo Performing Arts Centre now is. They had their firearms with them at that meeting. Also, compared to the monster meeting, there's no reports of firearms at the meeting.
No.
It was reported that tea chests used to be lined with lead, and they'd got the lead out of them and made a lot of bullets. It seems like it was a bit touch and go, and eureka, so to speak, as in bloodshed might have happened at Bendigo, but for a sophisticated gold commissioner.
Yeah, Panton was good.
Panton was good.
And that's the difference with Ballarat later.
Is this a fuse that we're following from Castlemaine, or is it like the landscape with outbreaks happening in different places?
It's a bit of both. Some people were involved in each occasion, and everybody knew what had happened and what was happening, so that, you know, they're conscious of a permanent position that the government's taking and that they have to resist. The government kept saying that, you know, these were meetings that were provoked by agitators. They kept saying agitators are stirring the people up. It's actually the opposite, that the people stirred up the agitators. That, you know, the protest comes and the agitators emerge, if you like, to voice the general attitude.
And this word agitators was a common word for
and
protest in these days.
Foreigners are doing this.
But the men on the podium at the Bendigo meeting were, again, urging non-violence.
Yeah, yeah.
And urging people, put away your guns.
Yeah.
Because there was a horseman galloped into Melbourne with the news for the tribe that there was revolution happening. He was quite wrong. It just didn't happen.
Yeah. But the non-violence goes right through, and it's still there at Eureka. It's only that the provocation was so huge that there was any attempt to take arms, and that's in a stockade, which you can interpret as a defensive position against further government action against them.
In going to an overview, this whole movement from the monster meeting, the Red Ribbon agitation through to Eureka, us people here today, what have we inherited from this? What's the legacy that's come through to us?
I think it's a double thing. It's something about the need for government to listen. And it's something about the right to stand against injustice